Hi, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to IDIS 300, Life After COVID. It's great to have you all back. I've been looking forward to this talk for a while. I'm Keith Mellinger. I'm the Dean for Mary Washington's College of Arts and Sciences. And this afternoon, we have a special treat. Our Chief of Staff at the University of Mary Washington, who's also a faculty member, Professor of History and American Studies here at the university, is going to talk to us about life after COVID for the university, and in a broader sense, not just about Mary Washington, but about higher ed in general. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. It's Dr. Jeffrey McClurkin. Now, just as a reminder, before we get started here, you have two options for communication during the presentation. The Q&A box below is the place where you can enter your questions for Dr. McClurkin, and we will moderate those at the end through a Q&A. You can give a thumbs up, an upvote to the questions you like the most, and those will rise to the surface, and we'll ask those first. But if you have any technical issues during the presentation, please put that in the chat box, and Dr. Rao, Dr. Lewis, or myself will try to get that addressed as quickly as possible to make sure we get those fixed so you can hear the presentation. But let's get started here. Dr. Jeffrey McClurkin, Professor of History and American Studies and our Chief of Staff, is going to talk to us about the university after COVID. Dr. McClurkin?
Thank you, Dean Mellinger. Welcome, everyone. All right. So there's a bit of an irony here, an oddity maybe, about asking a historian, someone whose job it is to look into the past, to talk about the future. And yet, I'm a historian who studies the impact of war on families and society. I'm a historian who looks at the relationship between institutions and mental health. I'm a historian who studies the history of technology, its relationship with culture. So I actually get asked a surprising amount to look into the future. And as Dean Mellinger's introduction suggests, there might be some good reasons to ask this particular historian to talk about the future of the university after COVID. I am, in fact, President Peno's Chief of Staff. I also serve as Clerk of the Board of Visitors. But I have some other jobs as well that I've taken on this year. At Mary Washington this year, I've been the co-coordinator of our COVID-19 implementation team. I have also served for the last 6 months as chair of the Public Higher Education COVID Directors Working Group. I am UMW's top user of Zoom, measured by total minutes. I don't know if that last one totally allows me to claim any special expertise today, but I think all of these roles allow me not just to talk about UMW in the post-pandemic world, but higher education more generally. I am still a historian, though, and so all predictions about the future have to start with the past. And so I think when we think about the last year, or last 15 months or 16 months, it's really easy to, I think, to forget about how much things have changed and about how many different places we were. In the spring of 2020, in March of last year, we were at this point where we thought we were sending students home briefly, and then we were sending them home for the semester. And we were in this place that sometimes is described as emergency remote teaching, right? We had students learning from home, we had faculty teaching from home, we had many staff working from home, although not all. And the challenges seemed overwhelming. Questions of technology access for students and for faculty and staff, whether it was internet access at home or shared access with others, lack of computers, lack of specialized software. We had a faculty who were not prepared to move entirely online, certainly not in the middle of a semester. And we were all dealing, I think, with fear and anxiety about the pandemic, about what this would mean for us, what this mean for everyone. Some of us could leave campus, some of us couldn't leave campus because of the nature of our jobs. Spring of 2020 was a difficult time. We made it through. We got then to the summer of 2020, we began planning for fall and spring. And schools began to create return to campus plans. Here in Virginia, we had to submit those plans to the State Council for Higher Education. Those plans had to include opening and training and testing and shutdown indicators. Here at Mary Washington, we were fortunate enough to be guided in our planning by these values from President Peno. If we look across the Commonwealth, we look across the nation, I think some schools scrambled more than others. I think some faculty members were more willing to change than others. I am incredibly proud of the UMW faculty and staff for the work they did to prepare for the fall. Just as one prominent example, Mary Washington Center for Teaching and our digital learning support group created a pedagogical professional development training, 8 weeks of digital pedagogy in what we called Refocus Online at UMW. And I genuinely believe that our faculty were better prepared than most institutions for the fall. And so we entered a fall of possibility and anxiety, but also hope that we really could pull all of this off. Now, one of the most important things about our implementation of the fall, about bringing students back in the fall, was about safety and about risk mitigation. So that meant spacing and masking and cleaning and daily attestations of health and symptoms, limits on gathering size, prevalence testing, entry testing, exit testing, and an encouragement of continuing on in our connections as virtual wherever possible. Those of us at Mary Washington became very familiar with MMDC, right? Monitor, mask, distance, clean, part of everyone's everyday vocabulary. And we had a plan in place to deal with cases when they did happen. Schools are not bubbles, they're not fortresses. Universities and colleges worked closely with local health departments to trace those cases, to isolate those positives, and quarantine those exposed. Again, I'm proud to say that Mary Washington had fewer cases than virtually any other school in the state this year, and that's a testament to our students and to our faculty and to our staff. But it turns out that supporting students who need to be in isolation or quarantine is a massive endeavor. It's a massive endeavor at every institution. Sometimes schools, at Mary Washington, we set aside entire residence halls. Other schools rented out entire hotels. The process of then supporting the students who were in quarantine or isolation, not just providing them food, but emotional, medical, and social support while they were in isolation or quarantine, proved to be an incredible challenge. More generally, remote work became normal for much of our teaching and learning and working, even as students were back on campus. And that was true for many of our employees as well as for many of our students. And then vaccines came along, right? As vaccines came along, institutions of higher ed spent much of the spring working incredibly hard with our local health districts to try to make sure that our faculty, our students, our staff, and contractors in every eligible category had access as soon as possible. But in these conditions, it's not surprising that learning in the fall looked very different. Some schools went entirely online, like most of the Virginia Community College system. Others, like Mary Washington, were closer to 60% online, and still others managed 2/3 of their classes in person. But regardless of the situation, if you had in-person classes, you had to space them out. This is a drawing of a floor plan for Dodd Auditorium, and that those white seats there are where people could actually sit, right? So auditoriums, ballrooms got put into classroom service. I taught in the fall in a class of 24 students in a space that holds well over 100. And as teachers and students, we had to get used to talking to and through masks. Of course, the options were not just in-person or online, but a continuum of options blending them to as synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid, all emerged in different ways for different courses at different institutions. Now, while all of this was difficult, we also saw many innovations in the face of adversity. Faculty engaged with students in new ways, staff worked with students and faculty in new ways, students engaged with each other in new ways, and there's an array of unforeseen benefits of the new modalities. Now, I don't have time to explore all these today, but Mary Washington actually held a day-long reflection at the end of the year, and the site's worth checking out, if only for the different topics and the wide variety of creative responses from the Mary Washington community to this challenging year. It's right there at umwacademy.org. Now, we saw powerful collaborations emerge, not just within the institution, but between institutions across the Commonwealth. Now, all of that sounds great, but there are also some pretty significant challenges. There was, it's fair to say, a diversity of impacts, not just of the pandemic, but of higher ed's responses to it. I talk regularly, weekly, with the other public higher ed COVID directors across the state, and one of them said something that really resonated with me. I think that captures, I think, this diversity of experiences. He said, despite the best planning, it is outcomes that matter. And institutions of higher education needed to ensure that all members of the community were protected from recognized health and safety risks and had the opportunity to achieve their academic goals. This is challenging work that fell on different parts of the community in different ways. And so there are a number of common themes of concern for us as we look at the experiences of our students and our employees over the last 15 months, and as we look forward to what's next. Technology access for students and employees continues to be a concern. The strain on the mental health of students, staff, and faculty was significant. The economic impact on students as uses of resource closets and food pantries and emergency financial aid increased. And then academic support for students who were literally and psychologically in different places than we're used to meeting them at. Broadly stated, I think it's also fair to say that the pandemic and our responses to it at the university, local, state, and national level have brought into stark relief the tensions between notions of personal freedom and community protection. And that's a constant thing that we're still seeing that tension in stark relief today. If we try to analyze what the overall impact of the pandemic on universities and its members, we could spend all day doing this, but I do want to just highlight a couple of things that I think are particularly important. First of all, we have to acknowledge the trauma of loss. Now, that loss is perhaps most significantly the loss of family and friends across the nation, but it also includes losses of experiences, of interactions, of expectations for a normal college experience, of expectations for a normal life. And for many universities and colleges, much of this last 16 months has meant reductions in revenues, in enrollments, in room and board fees, less money from events, from athletics, from other engagements, less money from fundraising, less money from external grants. It has also meant reductions in faculty and student research opportunities. It's challenged academic programs with strong in-person components. In some cases, most commonly we point to the science disciplines and the research there, but also studio art and music and theater and programs like our own historic preservation, right? It's hard to preserve a 300-year-old house remotely. We also have challenges as universities in recruitment opportunities. The pandemic has meant that prospective students haven't been able to come see our campuses. And for a school like ours, where bringing students in, having them imagine themselves on campus is a much more powerful recruiting tool. And we just haven't had the same kind of opportunities. And the pandemic has also represented an unprecedented diversion, a diversion of resources, both financial and human, into pandemic-related problems and solutions. Many universities have had to set aside or pause or set aside strategic priorities. And so universities across the nation are all asking, how many of these issues can we walk away from? How many of them will return to normal? How many will continue in a post-pandemic world? And will the fall actually be post-pandemic? So what happens next? Is the story ahead one of optimism? Is it one of loss? Is it one of change? And I got to be honest with you, I have a lot more questions than answers for you here today. We might even ask, is there actually a thing as life after COVID yet? I'm not clear that there is. Again, I talked to my fellow state public higher ed directors, and Michael Simas, who's VCU's Director of Environmental Health and Safety, captured, I think, most of the current thinking of that group. He said, it's very likely this pandemic becomes endemic. This virus is not going away, and we will need to adapt to its presence. We are likely looking at a future where COVID-19 remains active in pockets around the world, but more and more of us have immunity. It's possible booster shots may be needed. Higher education will need to continually invest in the physical and mental health and safety of its students, staff, and faculty. So it's in this world, I think, where vaccines become an incredibly important part of the conversation for the future of the university. In that realm, vaccines are the best answer to return to something close to normalcy. In the last few weeks, both the CDC and the American College Health Association have come out with incredibly strong and detailed statements on the essential role that vaccines should play in higher education. Now, the short version of it, I've got the links there. You can certainly take a look, but the short version is that schools that are close to full vaccination of students, faculty, and staff will be able to largely return to normal, whereas schools that aren't will have to continue a number of restrictions. So it raises all kinds of questions for those schools that aren't able to reach high levels of vaccination or full vaccination. How much testing should they do? How much quarantine and isolation space should they keep? Will restrictions all be lifted? Might we have to return those if there are a number of cases? And in what ways will these restrictions be affected by state and local laws and or guidelines? I think we've seen over the last couple of months a great deal of difference from one state to another in the way that they treat COVID and our stage in the pandemic. And we should acknowledge there are continuing COVID concerns about breakthrough cases, those cases that come after someone has been vaccinated, about concerns about particular variants emerging, and the issue of vaccine hesitancy. As we look to the fall, even schools that are fully vaccinated have to have plans in place to be ready to pivot back if there are outbreaks. And there are many questions still to be answered here, I think, beyond vaccines. Questions about modality, right? Are the modality changes, the variety of ways in which we have taught, how are those different now? How many of those are going to stay, right? We know that faculty and staff and students can teach and learn and work in multiple modalities, sometimes in multiple modalities at the same time. But how much will students expect online courses, even for residential students? How much will students want increased flexibility of offerings and modalities? Right now, residential schools like Mary Washington are certainly feeling a strong pull to be in person and to be normal, quote unquote, as much as possible. But we're trying to get a sense of what students want and expect. And this is especially true, I think, for students who have been in remote or partly remote learning in high school for the last 15 months. What are those students going to expect now? Speaking generally, many students want to return to a physical campus, into a physical classroom, but there are others that will want to continue online. In some ways, that divide overlays onto traditional undergraduate versus working adult profiles, but I think that's probably too simplistic for the pattern that's going to emerge over the next couple of years. Regardless, there will likely be more demand and more opportunity for online courses, hybrid courses, synchronous courses, and we can and should build on the innovations of increasing the percentage of courses online, even for residential students. The convenience of online is certainly there. The intimacy of synchronous, I think we've seen, the access that asynchronous offers, and hybrid is a set of choices that can be the best of all of those worlds. Now, part of that innovation in courses might also be in terms of scheduling courses, scheduling them outside of the normal semester-long time frame, or in different ways within the semester time frame. Some schools have moved their semesters around, others have offered January terms or more flexible summer options. It seems clear that at least some of these will continue. Now, what will determine what academic changes and innovations persist? Well, there are a variety of factors. Student demand is certainly very high up among them. Universities' evaluation of the successes of these various modalities, faculty ability and comfort, institutional commitment to improving teaching. And I think we also have to acknowledge just cultural resistance within the community. Now, I'm well aware that deans and provosts and cabinet members will play a big role in shaping what stays and what goes. John Norrie, in a recent EDUCAUSE review piece, said senior administrators in higher education need to rethink how to plan, advance, and deliver online instruction, harnessing what's been gained from the pandemic experience. And schools across the nation are going through that process now. But I really hope that we can retain many of the terrific innovations and develop skills among faculty for online and hybrid teaching, and among students for learning in these environments. Now, frankly, that's based on my own experiences teaching in-person and hybrid classes over the past year. But it's clear to me this is not the time to stop innovating. Investments in faculty development and flexible instructional models have been well spent, and we need to not just continue them, but increase them. And whatever the answer is about what students want for modalities, we're likely going to need to keep investing in teaching spaces that are flexible and allow for both in-person and distance engagement. So the question of modalities is a big one. What of that will continue and what of that will stay the same? Enrollments are another big question that all universities are facing right now. Today's Chronicle of Higher Education includes a story about how nationwide enrollments in the spring semester were 600,000 people lower than they were the year before. So that's 2021 versus 2020. That's a 3.5% drop. And now there are some key ways we can parse that data. We can maybe talk about that in the Q&A, as there are some groups and some locations, including Virginia for that matter, that actually saw modest growth over the past year. But the big question, the overall question is, will enrollments bounce back and what will they look like? One argument that they won't bounce back points to the looming demographic cliff coming by 2023, a 25% reduction in birth rates since the Great Recession. Now, it's not clear, but the pandemic may have just accelerated that decline in the number of students that are going to go to college each year. Add to those enrollment concerns the potential long-term financial impact of the pandemic on student and family finances, may put going to college out of reach for some families. And will international student enrollments paused during the pandemic increase again as the pandemic eases around the world? We have a similar question about the ability of our own students to engage in studying abroad in this post-pandemic, which hopefully post-pandemic world soon. Now, I don't want to just provide negative interpretations here. I think there are also some positive signs that we should point to. Some fields have seen further growth in the pandemic, or even because of it. We've seen a greater interest in health-related fields, computer science, digitally enabled work. And in a broader sense, as a safer, more fully open college experience fueled by vaccinations emerges as a reality, we may well see a bounce back as people who delayed their education come back to campuses. Regardless, enrollments, as always, are critical to the success of the post-pandemic university. I think we also need to consider how much institutions and in what ways institutions will continue to focus on the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The pandemic and the events of the past year have highlighted existing racial and socioeconomic and accessibility inequalities, and many institutions committed themselves to addressing those inequalities. So what resources and motivation will there be to continue that work in the post-pandemic world? And in what ways will internal and external constituencies continue to push for changes in access, inclusion, and representation across the university? Another big question is, what is the future of work at universities? A number of schools have already announced dates by which they expect employees will be back at work in person. Others are still figuring out what that transition looks like. So the questions here include how and which people will transition back to in-person work, and how much telework for universities will persist. How much of this is tied to the ability to support in-person populations? And what's the impact on work-life balance of employees of such a return? How will universities balance the differential impact or ability of work from home for certain employees versus others? And how will they prepare their graduates to work in a world of varying work modalities? I see that a number of people are asking about the PowerPoint. I stopped the PowerPoint. I'm not showing it anymore. No more. I don't have any more slides. So you're not missing anything. Another question, which of the technology investments that we've made during the pandemic will make sense to continue on? Just as one example, and perhaps an obvious example of an answer, will we see the continued use of video conferencing tools like Zoom in universities? I think the answer to that is pretty obviously yes. Whether it's in terms of telehealth and telecounseling services, whether it's in terms of student advising, office hours take on a whole new form when you don't actually have to go to the office to visit. Overall, I think the ability to conduct meetings and seminars and classes and lectures and discussions, partially or entirely virtually, is likely to continue on even as people are able to gather again in person. I think that's just a few of the potential efficiencies and savings that might stay. Hopefully, those efficiencies and savings will offset the increased costs and challenges that universities incurred in, say, setting up support for remote work and teaching and learning. I can't get to everything here, but let me just briefly lay out a series of other areas that are being discussed for the post-pandemic university, and I'm happy to sort of drill down on any of these in the Q&A. And I do want to just allude, if you're not familiar with the work of Brian Alexander, who's a writer and a Georgetown professor, who's actually spoken at Mary Washington before. His blog, brianalexander.org, talks a lot about the future of education, and so I'm influenced in some ways on some of the things he's raised here. But the first thing is actually something that Professor Marsh just talked about on Tuesday, and that is the impact of the pandemic on working mothers. I think there's a lot of questions still to be answered about how that has played out in higher education settings and what the impact of that will be long term. Much talk in the media Another topic, much topic has been in the media about learning loss in this last 15 months. I think the question is, will that prove to be a problem that needs to be solved systemically by universities, or will it need to be addressed on an individual student by student basis? Or does it turn out to be largely an unfounded fear, and that students have largely been able to keep up with their learning? Related question, will grading policies and practices developed over the pandemic period persist into the post-pandemic semesters? And I think part of the question here is whether they will persist at an institutional level and whether they will persist at a faculty level, right? So individual departments, individual faculty members might decide to continue some of those things, even if departments don't. Another question is, are we going to see any long-lasting impact on campus building design that might be out of concern or preparation out of lessons learned from the last pandemic? For example, are there more outside spaces being designed for use, or more options for distancing in classrooms or large halls, or more ventilation in general as we think through the lessons learned from COVID-19? Another question, will technology supports that emerged in the pandemic, like lending computers, lending cellular Wi-Fi hotspots, the development of virtual computer labs, are those going to continue to be needed in the post-pandemic period? And if so, how will they be supported? Finally, I just want to lay out what I see as a few high-level, large-scale predictions about institutions of higher education. And the first statement here is one that I think is hard for me to accept, but I think we need to accept it as a nation. And that is that some colleges and universities are going to fail in the next few years. Merge with other institutions. The reality is that for some institutions, the economic hit will be too much. The demographic cliff will be too great to scale. And I think we need to be aware that there are also smaller versions of that. In February of 2021, the Chronicle of Higher Education ran an article where they had analyzed that academia had lost about 650,000 jobs in the last year. How many of those will come back or not, I think is unclear. But even those institutions that don't fail are still going to face, I think, a tough 12 to 24 months of adjustment to the pandemic economic impact and the enrollment impact. So I think some schools are going to have to make cuts in programs or personnel, especially as Federal CARES Act and additional pandemic funding to higher education begins to go away. I do think one important question is how much will state and/or federal governments invest or reinvest in higher education, and what forms will that investment take? Certainly here in Virginia, we've seen increasing interest in increasing the funding for higher education, increasing support for higher education, and we hope that continues in the years to come. So some schools will fail, hopefully just a few. Some schools will face a tough 12 to 24 months of adjustment. Some schools are going to continue on largely as they are because they're large enough or they're important enough in the larger scheme of American higher education to keep doing what they're doing as they've been doing it. And here I'm really talking about schools like Harvard and Yale and Stanford. They might make tweaks to what they do, but probably aren't going to have to change rather significantly. But I think on the whole, most schools will adapt to a post-pandemic world. Some of them may end up shifting their missions. Some may find their missions take them in new directions. But I also think many schools will rise from the pandemic with renewed purpose, eager to return to normal, the things that were most missed, while reviewing and keeping and investing in those changes that have made things better for students and staff and faculty. And those schools that can find their niche, that can make their case about who they are and what they have learned and what and how they teach in a post-pandemic world will be successful. But the answer, by the way, is going to be different for each university, each college. Finally, my fervent hope is that through these discussions, there will also be an intensified prioritization of the value of engagement with others, of the value of human interaction as critical and essential for the learning process. That focus on human interaction, whether it's mediated by digital tools or not, should continue to be at the center of all higher education institutions, pandemic or not. And with that, I'm happy to turn to the questions. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. McClurkin. That was really fascinating perspective on what we've been through and what we have coming ahead. And there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. I don't know that we'll be able to get to all of them, but the top question really had to do about entrance requirements that have changed, about SAT and ACT requirements being waived. And do you think that this is a permanent change that universities are going to be making?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't want to get too far outside my own wheelhouse because I do not work in admissions, but certainly by looking at the overall pattern, I think what we do see is there have been concerns about some of these tests as markers, as indicators for admissions, and so this is not an entirely new discussion. Schools like Mary Washington have had an alternative, an option to not submit those scores. I think we're seeing some other schools begin to come along with this. Whether they will return back, I think, will depend honestly on how successful they feel they are in attracting students. And if they feel like it would help their get a better class, then they will do that. And if they think they need to reinstitute them, they will. My own personal sense is that and this is, I am not speaking for the University of Mary Washington at the moment here. My own personal sense is I don't think these are as effective as other indicators in someone's success in college. So longer term, I think it's likely we're going to see more of these things go away.
Well, thank you, Dr. McClurkin. I have the next question, and it really harkens back to the beginning of the presentation when you noted kind of the irony of being a historian asking to look forward. Now, keep that historian hat on, and also as an educator, inevitably the story of higher education as it went through the pandemic and hopefully passes through the pandemic, and we see the pandemic in our rearview mirror. At some point, we're going to be writing about this in the textbooks. How would you like that story to be written? What do you think should be emphasized? What items, what themes should be considered? If you had a chance to write that history, what would it look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sean. Thank you. It seems to me what I would hope be part of the story would be the way that, despite the reputation for universities being slow to change, that there be some recognition about how fast actually we were able to pivot, about how fast we were able to adapt, and how we were able to figure out a way, frankly, not always with help of the state or the federal government, we were able to figure out how to reopen, and to reopen in a way that allowed our students to come back and allowed our education to continue in a way that met the needs of as many students and faculty and staff as possible. I think longer term, we're going to have to see whether or not there is a learning loss issue. Longer term, I think we're going to have to see if there's an impact on enrollment. I think those are things that as a historian, I know you really need to wait 5 or 10 years to see some of those longer term impacts. But I would hope that there's a recognition of the things we did right. I also know as a historian there would need to be appropriate critiques of the things we made mistakes on, of the ways that the decisions that we made impacted people differently than we expected, the unexpected impacts of some of the decisions that we made, for people who weren't able to access their education in the same way that they were before the pandemic. And so I think there are ways that we have not met everyone's needs, and we should, and I'm sure will be held accountable for that.
Yeah, that's probably right. Thanks for that. So, how is Virginia compared to the rest of the country? I guess is the gist of the next question. I don't know how much you can comment on this, but part of the question starts by asking if there's schools in Virginia that really have already failed. I'm not aware of any, but I'm curious to hear your response to that. But then I think the broader question, though, is how Virginia is doing compared to other states. Are we doing well compared to other states? And if so, why? What is it about us?
Well, I think so there are a couple of pieces there. I think it depends on how we're defining closing and how we're defining failure, right? So there aren't schools in Virginia that have closed in the way that I talked about in terms of like genuinely shutting down and going out of business. There are a few schools in the Northeast that we've seen go through that process over the last, say, 6 months or so. We have had, JMU did send its students home. We did have some schools that either didn't return immediately, but they continued on. No school really closed in the sense they stopped educating students, and I think that's a good sign. I think Virginia has a strong system of higher education, especially public higher education, and that was true beforehand. I do think that even though we're not part of a full-blown system, say like the University of California or the University of North Carolina, I think the schools in Virginia worked pretty well together. We helped each other out. We negotiated for tests, for example, when we had trouble getting access to COVID tests more generally. We negotiated together to get access to tests. So I do think that there's a level of success in the state. I don't know that I would say that that we did significantly better than other states, but I think we did well. Again, I think this is something that's going to be much more obvious 10 years from now as we look back than it is in this moment. So.
This next question maybe builds off on that a little bit. You'd said earlier that we were able to keep our cases pretty low here on campus, despite we don't live in a bubble. We are a public campus. And so the next question has to do with that and vaccinations. So how can we really be sure that everyone who comes on our campus is fully vaccinated? And where does us being open to the public but yet wanting to protect the health of our students and faculty and staff?
Yeah, that's the $3 trillion question, right? I think that we are at a point where, because of the changes that the federal government's made, the CDC's recommendations, the Governor Northam's change, where we really have kind of placed the burden on individuals to be responsible for their own health. And so in a practical sense, as we look towards the fall, the way that we're going to address that in terms of our own population is that people have to be vaccinated, and if they're not vaccinated, then there are consequences, among which are that they will be tested weekly and they will have to go through regular attestation. In terms of visitors, I think we've learned a lot over the course of the pandemic, and one of the things I think that we've learned is somebody who's walking across campus is probably not a threat to us. Somebody from the outside, that outdoor spaces are just much safer than indoor spaces. So I think that's one of the things that that we have to keep in mind. The other is, if you are vaccinated, you are in a much safer position, regardless of what everyone else does. So if you can take care of yourself, if you can go ahead and get fully vaccinated, then you can worry less about others around you. And that's really why President Payne made the decision for Mary Washington to have a requirement for vaccinations, because it was the best way to ensure that the vast majority of the community would be protected.
Now, the next question, Dr. McClurkin, builds on this, and we've touched on it a bit, and you've already mentioned some of the success, and I know we're always very cautious not to spike the football too early. We're not fully out of the pandemic yet, but to date, even before we had vaccines available, UMW has been a real success story in terms of keeping the number of cases very low, the prevalence rate very low. What's led to that, and how has it compared to schools across the country?
Yeah, I have to attribute that to the community, to the fact that that students, faculty, and staff, the Mary Washington community, bought into what needed to be done to keep not just ourselves safe, but our fellow community members safe. And it really is a testament to I think what is a common value at Mary Washington, right? Which is a sense of community that really is about taking care of each other. It goes back to, I think, the strong service bent that many of our students and faculty and staff have. I think people listened to the advice that we were given, and they followed the guidelines. I really was struck by how in the statewide meetings that we would just not be having the problems that other institutions would be having. And part of that is just that for the most part, our students didn't do the things that caused problems at other institutions.
I'm curious, do you think that's part of the sort of culture of service at this institution? That was sort of my sense.
Yeah, I do. And honestly, I mean, I talked with the students in my classes, and that was the sense I got from them as well. Like they took very seriously this notion. I had a conversation with a mother at one point, and she was telling me this story about dropping her son off in the fall. And the story she said was like she dropped her son off, and he was talking with his roommates about what their plans were going to be and how they were going to make sure they kept each other safe and how they were going to respect each other, right? Respect the bubble that they were creating. And he said, and he comes over to his mother, and she's getting ready to go, and he's like, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm not going to be the reason we go home," right? And that sense of dedication to each other, not just to his own experience, but to the community, is such an integral part of Mary Washington. It's one of the things I think we all love about teaching here, and it's part of why we're successful. I have no doubt.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So the next question is from an alum, class of 17, Alice. Hi, Alice. Welcome to the class. The question really is about how the costs changed, if they did change. When we shifted to an online format, did that reduce the cost of education on either side, either from the university side or for the building side to the students? And with, of course, there's a lot of discussion nowadays about the cost of higher education and student debt. What are your thoughts on that? And how did Mary Washington respond to
Sure.
these concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of pieces to that. And thanks for the question, Alice. As someone who has been involved in online education in a variety of formats, there is a sense that online education costs less, when unfortunately the reality is in many cases it costs more because of the additional infrastructure that you have to put into place to support it. I really do feel like our faculty were trained at a level, and they embrace. I mean, hundreds of faculty joined that summer, the summer faculty development that the Center for Teaching put on. So no, the short answer, Alice, is there was no reduction in tuition as a result of that. I will tell you it was something we did do that other schools did not do or didn't do to the same extent, and that is that because we started a little bit late and ended a little bit early where students were on campus, we actually reduced the cost of the fall semester by those weeks in terms of room and board rates. And there were some other schools also did that pro rata amount, but there were some schools that did not. And that was really important to President Payno, that we recognized that those students were not getting access to the food and to the housing. So we did make that adjustment, but not for tuition.
Thanks for that. The next question has to do more on the employee side of the university. And this question is saying that in other industries, both public and private employers are reporting that employees now seeing telework as a highly valued benefit, and that they're even seeking employment that values telework. So the question is, what does this mean for a traditional face-to-face school like UMW is?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And it's one that we have a whole committee working on right now, the Future of Work Committee, that President Payno put together. Yeah, there's no question this is something we have to figure out. And the balance, as the questioner has put it, is really between the expectation of a traditional residential liberal arts school and the expectation that people will be there to support the students in person, and the incredible value that employees have gotten from being able to work from home at least part of the time. I'm doing this from my house. This is not my office on campus. I'm at home, and I have been working a few days a week on campus and a few days a week at home, and there's been real value to that for my life. So figuring out what that looks like and figuring out how we can meet student needs and allow for employee options and flexibility, I think is one of our next big questions. In the end, with these difficult questions, I think Mary Washington has taken the approach, and I've heard President Panos say this a number of times. We start with what's best for the students, and I think that will be a driving force. But we certainly want to make sure that that one of the lessons we don't learn, one of the lessons that we don't leave behind from the pandemic, is that there are things that we can do remotely, that we don't have to be there in person for. So I think more to come on that.
Now, the next question is perfect for a historian, especially somebody that's been looking at higher education. You know, we're focusing right now on the impact the pandemic will have on higher education going forward. Look back to past events, past pandemics, world events that impacted higher education and maybe changed it in a way that we now consider normal. Are there any examples like that?
So if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Farrell will be coming on in a few short days. I don't know exactly when she's talking, but I wouldn't want to steal any of her thunder as my colleague in the history department. And part of that, frankly, is I'm not honestly sure that I have an answer that is satisfactory. There's no question that previous disasters and conflicts, World War II, for example, fundamentally reshaped the higher education system. But that had as much to do with the policies coming out of World War II as it did World War II itself. I think it will be interesting to see if there are similar kinds of pent-up demands. I will tell you that I know that during the influenza outbreak of 1918 and 1919, Mary Washington, or Mary Washington's earlier version, the State College in Fredericksburg, State Normal College in Fredericksburg, did shut down. And the only person who died was the head of the history department, which my students pointed out to me when I was department chair. So, but after that, what we saw is that there was a bump, right? There was a bump in enrollment. There was a sort of pent up demand in higher education. There was an increase in health professions. You know, whether that translates more broadly, I think I'll leave to Dr. Farrell to answer.
Right. Well, we have a question here from one of our colleagues in Monroe Hall. Boy, I don't want to mess this one up. I better get this just right, because this is Dr. Cooperman, who's going to be joining us in the class coming up here soon, a couple lectures from now. But we all know at the national and state level, there's been a divide between, the science, the politics of COVID. How has higher ed responded to that? Maybe if you could say a little bit about what Mary Washington has done to deal with that divide, but at a national level too.
Yeah, thanks, Rosalind. Yeah, I mean, this has obviously been one of the most difficult things about addressing a pandemic in the middle of an incredibly partisan time, and it is, I think, unfortunate in the sense that it's never good when you map politics onto health, and yet it happens all the time. So I think what we have tried to do is to do what we would do in an academic setting anyway, is go to the sources, and we look to state and local health officials. We talk to doctors. We look to the CDC, and we evaluated the evidence, and we evaluated the advice that we were given, and when we made the best decisions we could. As much as possible, we've tried to respect a variety of perspectives, but we've also had to recognize that there are times, and I sort of alluded to this, that there are times when we have had to choose community health over personal freedom. And I think that's been true across the board during the pandemic. And so we have made people angry with choices that we've made. And at those points, we've just tried to explain our reasoning as much as possible and acknowledge that not everyone's going to agree with us, and go from there.
Okay, so our next question comes from another one of your colleagues, Dr. Steve Greenlaw. And he wants to know if you could talk a little bit about the tools that faculty used during the pandemic that you think will continue to be used even as faculty return to face-to-face teaching.
Well, I think Steve could answer this question much better than I can, but yeah, I know a setup when I see it. I think that to me, the things that were most helpful to me, there's no question video conferencing tools like Zoom continue to have an important place in teaching. I think it was interesting to see the use of things like Google Jamboards spread pretty widely. I think communication tools like Slack, and also I used pretty effectively in my classes WordPress and our the domain of one's own platforms. I think they were incredibly useful. I will say, as somebody who was not always liked using Canvas, that I gained a greater appreciation of Canvas this semester than I've probably had before. It hurts me a little bit to admit that, but because I tend to like to go off and build my own things. But so I think the ability to providing the ability to record lectures easily, or record classes easily, or record little clips, I think is particularly useful. So Screencast-O-Matic and tools like that, I think, are going to continue to be important. That's probably enough. I mean, it's not enough for Steve, but it's probably enough for everybody else who's watching.
We'll have to get Steve to come in and share his list as well.
There you go.
That's right. I think as a bit of an extension of that, one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been to see the way that everyone has pitched in to be very flexible. And this next question, I think, is a really great one about access. As we look back on the experience over the pandemic and wondering about going forward, given the flexibility that has been provided, do we anticipate finding more alternatives for students with disabilities to make sure that they have access that maybe they didn't really have before the pandemic, but they have had over the last 16 months or so?
Yeah, I think that's when I mentioned something about unforeseen benefits of the pandemic, one of them that I was thinking of really is the fact that as we moved into these hybrid spaces or fully online spaces, we provided faculty with training and support to make the work that they do and the materials they produce more accessible. And I think that there are, that's another thing that I'd like us not to lose. I think we have to figure out how to support that on a mass scale when the default is in person as opposed to online. But there's no question, I think, that a number of faculty have learned just the process by which they can take either a universal design approach or a accessibility first approach. That it would be a real shame if we weren't able to hold on to that aspect. And I think just a general sense of encouragement, that flexibility in the way that we produce materials and the way that we support all our students and understanding they're coming to us at different points and with different needs, I think has been a particularly important lesson for the pandemic.
Yeah. So we heard you discuss earlier about the expectation from the president that at Mary Washington everybody will be vaccinated. What do we do about the students who can't be vaccinated, immunocompromised or whatever? How is the university dealing with those sorts of situations?
Yeah, so there is a requirement that students are vaccinated, but there are two types of exemptions for that. One is medical exemption, and the other is a religious exemption. In order to ensure the safety of those students, we would not prevent them from coming to campus. They would be allowed to come to campus. We would just require them to continue on with the Eagle Health Journal and do a daily attestation and to be tested weekly, just to make sure that that they and the other people who are unable to get the vaccine will continue to be protected in that way.
So the next question is about what do you think the future of living on campus versus commuting will be? This question says that COVID has taught us that campus life is very important, but it has also taught us that we can remain in college virtually or commuting for less money, frankly. What do you think is the future of living on campus versus commuting?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, the trends were already heading that way a little bit, just more generally, with more and more students commuting rather than living residentially. That's true across the board. I think there will continue to be more students who commute. We certainly are planning as we look ahead that there'll be fewer students living on campus in the years to come than we've had before. I do think we have a lot of evidence that suggests that living on campus is actually really good for students, including just most straightforward way is that students who live on campus have a higher GPA than students who live off campus, significantly higher. And so they retain at a higher level, they graduate at a higher level. And so there's lots of reasons we need to continue to encourage that. But it is a real, I take very seriously the housing cost question, and it is possible for some families and for some students to make it work to commute and not to live on campus. And I think that's fine too. We have to continue to make sure that we support both our on-campus and off-campus students fully.
Well, thank you, Dr. McClurkin. And I have the last item coming from the Q&A, and it's actually not a question, but I do want to share this with you and give you a chance to respond if you'd like to. This looks like it's coming from a student who says that they just wanted to say thank you for doing so much to keep us safe. Many of my college friends throughout the state had COVID scares or contracted COVID due to their college's poor reactions or poor accommodations to the event. And it makes me very appreciative, they say, that you all were able to provide us with a college experience while keeping us safe. And I think on behalf of the faculty and staff, we appreciate that as well. I think the university has done a tremendous job of maintaining safety, putting public health above all else. So thank you to you and the implementation team for all of that. And now I'm going to force you to reply to that if you would like to.
Well, let me just say thank you on behalf of the implementation team, but also this, as I said earlier, this only works if everyone bought into it, and everyone did, and that's why we were able to do this, and that's why we were as successful as we were, because of who the students, faculty, and staff of Mary Washington are. So thanks to all of you.
I think you're exactly right. It says a lot about the UMW community to see how people were able to come together, the entire community come together to get through this crisis and come out much stronger as a result. Thank you, Dr. Jeffrey McClurkin, Professor of History, Chief of Staff at UMW, for this really informative and engaging talk. You got through a record number of questions. I think this is the most questions we've gotten through in a Q&A. Still many others that are left, and I'm sure that if anybody has a question for Dr. McClurkin that you'd like to follow up, you can contact him through our webpage on the UMW site. Thank you again, Dr. McClurkin. We appreciate that. Before I let everybody go, I want to remind you that we continue next Tuesday on June 15th at 4 o'clock with Dr. Julia Delancey, Professor of Art History, with a really great presentation. I'm looking forward to this one, titled "What Happened Next? Art and Architecture in Florence After the Black Death." Certainly looking back at some historical examples and drawing some parallels, and really harkens to some of the questions we had in this Q&A. Looking forward to seeing that discussion on Tuesday, June 15th. For those incoming students, don't forget that we have discussion groups coming up in a few minutes. Thanks everybody for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.